Good morning, BookTube. We are back. This is ML Clark coming to you with Better Worlds Theory, YouTube edition. I am joined, as always, by my special guest, The Highway, and it is Ciclovia, so there shouldn't be too many trucks, but nonetheless, there might be children, there might be dogs. If you're really lucky, you might get a squawking macaw. But nonetheless, more important than all of those right now is that today we're going to do something a little bit different. Those who can see the screen will see that I have a book cover up. I was talking about a mid-century sci-fi writer just a little while ago, and it brought out some nostalgia. I went through some of his old work, and I thought it might be a really good break from discussing some of the more recent pieces, although we are going to be covering an Asimov's issue in an upcoming piece. We're going to be looking at a couple indie stories, and I have a new book, 2024, that I am just in the middle of as well, that I will be talking about here in a few weeks' time too. So we're going to try to keep a good range of work going, but as routine listeners might recall, we tend to talk a lot about industry. I like to contextualize what we're reading, whether it's something in a certain subgenre or if it is in a format that's a little bit atypical. It's best to talk about the context, the actual ways in which something gets made. And that's part of the reason that this author came back to me this week. I also have, like many writers, many roles. And in one of my roles, I am so fortunate to be able to signal boost a lot of wonderful nonfiction articles by people who are writing for professional and professionalizing writers, sharing things that might be useful in their own work. And I will be looking forward to sharing, coming down the pipe sometime soon, a piece by Jeff Reynolds on the history of a myth, a little bit of a myth that we have about the glory days when it was easy to make a career writing. Yes and no, as the piece discusses. And it uses one example, but I was thinking a little bit of another one when I was reviewing the work as editor for the SFF blog. So we're going to talk a little bit about that context, in part because it's extremely important to remember that every era has its highs and its lows. And as much as we might have a sort of gloss of nostalgia for other periods, it's better just to think about the fact that the pressure points we have today when it comes to funding existed in another era as well. They were managed differently, and the fact that they existed in both is something that can be useful for remembering that there's always a material side to production. If we want good work, if we want to talk about delightful stories, we need to think about context. And it impacts the context especially because different kinds of science fiction come out of different eras, and it's not that one era is better or worse, but it's responding to different elements of the surrounding culture. So we'll have a little sense of what I mean when I pull from this collection, Store of the Worlds, the Stories of Robert Sheckley, and it is a beautiful NYRB edition. I love NYRB books. Back in Canada, I used to collect quite a few of them because you get such a wealth of esoteric writing, and I've run into phenomenal authors. I've met authors that I would never have known otherwise, plucked a little bit from obscurity, or at least given a second life, and just absolutely marvelous. So this one was elevated a little bit by Alex Abramovich and Jonathan Lethem. They were the editors for this piece, and they offered a little bit of an overview as well. But honestly, I've read a few different stories about Sheckley's life, which have a more roving tone to them, but I'm really quite impressed with how much they managed to compress to one paragraph for this edition. So I'm just going to read the one paragraph of his life so you get an overview. But we'll talk a little bit about his character as a person and a little bit more about the context in which he was writing in the introduction by the two editors to the collection. Editing, again, is so important for curation. It's so important for giving us the context we need to understand what we are reading, which is not to say that we can't go in fresh. The stories in this person's career, many of you can go in fresh, but there is an added level, an added wealth to knowing a little bit more about the context in which he was writing. So, Robert Sheckley was born in New York City and raised in Maplewood, New Jersey. I overlooked the date stamps, 1928 to 2005. So that gives you a little bit sense of the range for his life. He joined the Army shortly after high school and served in Korea from 1946 to 1948. Returning to New York, Sheckley completed a BA degree at New York University and later took a job in an aircraft factory, leaving as soon as he was able to support himself by selling short stories. And even that just crunches so much because there was a scramble to try to find work before he entered the Army, and there was a scramble after as well, which is important to remember when we think sometimes that there was one job, that a person worked at a factory for their whole life and that was it. That is true for some, but there were also a lot of folks who just hustled and tried to find a place to fit in for as long as they could. In the 1950s and 60s, his stories appeared regularly in science fiction magazines, especially Galaxy, and then wait for it, as well as in Playboy and Esquire. And that's, again, this is covering quite a bit, but very much the funny part is that the idea is that he elevated in some ways to, oh yeah, he became a common writer in Playboy, because that was a very different publication back then. It was an all-interest magazine. When people said, but I read it for the articles, sometimes it was true. Sometimes but I read it for the science fiction. There was some good stuff published in Playboy. Yeah, very different era. In addition to the science fiction for which he is best known, Sheckley also wrote suspense and mystery stories and television screenplays. And again, even that is somewhat crunching things because he also did novelizations of some major series. So you might find him attached to projects that are quite familiar to folks from 1990 science fiction. But again, crunch for one paragraph. From 1979 to 1982, he was the fiction editor of Omni magazine. And that doesn't, again, he had a sort of dropping in and dropping out, so that's generous in terms of the way it's been described here. Sheckley traveled widely, settling for stretches of time in Greenwich Village, Ibiza, London, Portland, and Portland, Oregon. So quite a little bit of a range there. He also, again, it's not included here, but he did have some nonfiction work that involved talking a little bit about Middle East contexts and other cultures. I haven't had a chance to go back and look at his takes on some of those things. I'm a little bit nervous about some of them, but I imagine that he did a pretty frank job by looking at the places where he published on those nonfiction pieces, maybe a cursory overview, but working to expand everyday readers' understanding of different cultures and parts of the world. Many of Sheckley's more than 15 novels and roughly 400 short stories have been translated, and 4 have been adapted for film. And again, that's so passive. It's a little bit passive. It's excluding the fact that he had especially one breakaway work, which I was thinking about reading today, but I thought to myself, there are already so many translations and adaptations of Watchbird that there's no point. And Watchbird is a really interesting piece because we often talk about anxieties about drone warfare and AI today, and Watchbird is one of those pieces that reminds you, oh, this has been an anxiety for a very, very, very long time. Writers have been warning about this issue for a while, and then some people have just taken notes in the wrong way and used them to develop these nightmare worlds. In 2001, he was named author emeritus by the Science Fiction Fantasy and Fantasy Writers of America. It doesn't talk about his sad ending, unfortunately. He had a sharp decline while he was overseas. He was actually in Ukraine for a conference when he had a medical event, and after that there was a return to a kind of hospice care and decline therein. But he moved, he lived, which is, I guess, the best one can say. And the way that these two talk about him after, they have a very dry bit of commentary. They call him oh my goodness, we have a motorcycle in the background that doesn't let me just say. Okay, it's past. They call him a comedian who rains on his own parade. And I love this description. You'll see why they say this in a second, because I'm scrolling right now to the introduction section that they have. And the wide range of commentary that they provide, a little bit about setting, about how difficult it is to pin him down. Is his writing surrealist? Is it anti-realist? Fabulous. The idea of him having a quirky, very distinct voice is part of the reason that I fell in love with him from first read. I'm going to read for you today the story that I first read of his. It might be an odd one. You might think after, why on earth was this one the one that enamored me? But there were quite a few pieces that have this sort of straight, very plain-spoken prose in some ways, but playful, and that leads to a very special moment in time when you can do that. You can't write like Sheckley today necessarily and get away with it, because the context is different, because the kind of work that he was doing has been done, because the era has passed. So one paragraph from the two of them to describe his stories. Sheckley's stories operate as irresistible language artifacts, like extended puns or paradoxes, off-kilter, provocative, unsettling, even if partly silly. They're like psychedelic lamps that cast an eerie light in one room where they're encountered, but then turn out to transform one's view of all subsequent rooms. These are the kind of stories which, if young or otherwise inattentive to at first encounter, you may forget the titles and the author's name, only to rediscover them in some anthology many years later with a sense of recognition akin to discovering someone else recounting a dream that you yourself once had. Now, it's a little unfair to the young or otherwise inattentive, because a lot of the naming traditions for stories back then weren't exactly the sharpest. So if you go down a list of Sheckley's stories, most of the stories is just a huge section of stories that start with the. But he definitely, by publishing about 400 stories, churning work out, embodies a really important aspect of the era. So he was one of those people who lucked out. He had that job working first for the military, after not entirely being able to find a job outside of the military for himself, and then after the moment that he had a chance to leave his civvy job, he took it, and the moment he was able to make money off of stories, he dove into it, but by producing a tremendous amount of work. And that's extremely important to remember. It's something that comes up in Jeff Reynolds' piece, which I look forward to sharing with folks once it comes up on the blog. And then we also, again, we have so many pieces. We're moving toward talking more about history. We've really encouraged folks to try to share work in more of those modes, and we have just a wonderful slate coming down the pike when it comes to how best to write about history, think about history, engage with history, but also some of the stuff that we really love is just talking about the history itself. And we have a few pieces during my time in that role that focus very much on thinking about the long-standing traditions, both in the writing of science fiction and in some of the contexts that are common to our worlds. But we want to get down now to the fun stuff in terms of the 1953. So this is a good little paragraph to describe some of the context of his writing period. And again, it's easy to build a sense of nostalgia, in part because it feels like it was easier, but it was just different. So he has, after a paragraph that tries to negotiate the difference between Playboy for everyday readers and Esquire, thinking, oh, this is outside the strict limits of the SF field. Well, again, those kinds of market divisions are sometimes rigidly drawn today, and they weren't as rigidly drawn in other periods because speculative fiction is all around us. But after they talk about those divisions, the two editors say, this matters not because of some general principle that such boundaries should be broken down. In retrospect, any such sentiments are useless. But because in 1953, the SF field was something more than a social formation or a loose bundle of tropes. It was a kind of argument conducted in collective imaginative space about what kinds of fictional responses to the 20th century, with its velocity of wonders and horrors, were possible or appropriate. Sheckley's brilliant stories entered into the thick of this argument and became essential to it. Some of their lasting vitality is traceable to this dynamic, even when that framework is obscured. To those only superficially familiar with the history of American SF, Sheckley may appear to write in lonely skepticism, against what are often presented as its technocratic rationalism and optimism. That form of skepticism, however, was by the time of Sheckley's appearance already a valued part of the field. Sheckley's sardonic outcry, his characteristic tone, satire, writing, an undertow of despair, I love that description, extended from the morbid and agonistic strains in earlier SF writers like Theodore Sturgeon, Henry Kuttner, and C.M. Kornbluth. The lineage is what made his work legible in the field, and what allowed it to embolden the SF writers who came after, like Philip K. Dick, Harlan Ellison, and J.G. Ballard. So there was a space for that kind of a little bit off the cuff, more lighthearted playfulness after a lot of banging on about danger. But even then, again, Watchbird is a work that illustrates the danger of things. So it's not as if Sheckley was somehow at a remove. It was this seething cauldron of many possibilities, throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks. Another really good piece that I was recommending earlier this week is the titular story from this collection, Store of the Worlds. It also has a really good example of the two in balance. Now, they talk about other aspects, other cultural backdrop for the work. We're not going to focus on that necessarily because I really just want to give you a sense of Sheckley. So in 1979, Sheckley was asked to sort of put together his greatest hits. And in the introduction to the piece, he wrote, "From this position, these stories from a vanished age appear to me safe, acceptable, commodities sanctioned by their own continued existence and given a mysterious and no doubt spurious air of rightness by the processes of time. Yet when I wrote them, each story involved me in a dangerous movement into an unfamiliar situation, and each story initiated a process in which a concept, itself sometimes barely visible, was to be freighted with words, and perhaps sunk by them." And that just hit me when I first read this, because I have had that experience, maybe other writers have too, of being so nervous about writing something. In that moment, it feels so anxiety-inducing to say, okay, I'm going to write, on this theme, oh my goodness, this character's going to have this issue, something's going to happen. And you get nervous about how it's going to be perceived because of the context in which you're writing. And I know for myself that sometimes I've been so consumed and caught up by that, thinking, okay, I've said something really daring, really controversial here. And then after, when it's published, it just looks harmless, limp upon the floor. It just takes on another life after you've gone through the process. And that's because the stories are really conversations with yourself. I've said this before, I'll say this again. We do have to remember as authors that we don't first write for other people. We are first in conversation with ourselves. And those moments of doubt, that stress, that sense of coming into a dangerous movement into an unfamiliar situation, that's us trying to get the story for ourselves, trying to understand the process for ourselves. And then this is another joy. He added, "I have nothing to say about the stories themselves." I mean, good. To talk about them, I would have to reread them, and I went through entirely enough hell writing them ever to want to look at them again. Anyhow, a glance at the contents page brings them all back to me, as well as the dingy rooms in crumbling brownstones in New York where I wrote most of them. And then this is where they come to their conclusion. That's the sound of Robert Sheckley, morose comedian, raining on his own parade. We wish he could be around to rain on this one, which is very lovely. Again, I think I do the same too. I do rain on my own parade a lot. I don't know many other authors who have the same response that I do when a lot of people say, "Oh, what have you written? Where can I find your work?" And my immediate caution is, just so you know, it might not be for you. You can find these things here, but if you don't like the work, by all means, do not feel at all obligated to keep reading it. There's so much wonderful work out there. Let me know what kind of things you like. I can probably recommend a lot of authors for you. And it's not because I'm uncomfortable. Like, obviously, I'm a writer. I want readers. But I do find sometimes there are parasocial relationships, and there's this overarching sense of you must read this work to demonstrate care for the person. For instance, a lot of friends sometimes will apologize. "Oh, I'm so sorry I hadn't had a chance to read your latest story." Fine, you're living your life. That's okay. I don't care. And I mean it. Like, I write passionately, and I get Many times the wonderful gift of a random stranger who doesn't know me, who never felt obligated, who wasn't in conversation, and said, oh, I should go off and read something by this author to follow up on this, and so that I can have something to say, so that I can say that I read their work. A random reader who has none of those parasocial obligations, who just reads your work and then says online, wow, I really enjoyed this piece by M.L. Clark. Oh my gosh, it's just gorgeous, because that's how you know it's really the work. It's the work that is actually sung out and connected with somebody at a specific time and place, and it's so special. And again, that's not to deride people who take different approaches. There's so much signal boosting. My work is out. You've got to read this. Please read this. Share this work widely. Buy my book. And I might be the only author. There are probably others out there, but I will say very cautiously, this work isn't for everybody. But if this is your subgenre, if this is something you might be interested in, I have something that's available here. So I think Sheckley and I would have gotten along swimmingly if I'd ever had a chance to meet him. But again, parasocial relationships, I much prefer meeting people on the page. And that's always been the way of things. So let's meet Sheckley on the page. And again, Sheckley doesn't care. Sheckley's dead, so he definitely doesn't care right now. But we're going to read this piece so you get a sense of the story, and we're going to talk a little bit more about context, because his story, the story that I've chosen, is a piece that avoided a very big issue that another piece from around the era got into, and we'll talk about why after. But I just want you to enjoy the piece, and usually when I share reviews, I have to be cagey because I don't want to give away the full story. I want you to go off and read and enjoy it, as long as it's someone else's. But for this piece, we're going to sit with it together, and then we're going to talk about it. So hopefully the motorcycles, the trucks, the dogs, the screaming children, and the macaws will all be very nice to us, and we'll just have a soothing ambiance. This is The Monsters by Robert Sheckley. Cordovere and Hum stood on the rocky mountaintop, watching the new thing happen. Both felt rather good about it. It was undoubtedly the newest thing that had happened for some time. By the way the sunlight glints from it, Hum said, I'd say it is made of metal. I'll accept that, Cordovere said, but what holds it up in the air? They both stared intently down to the valley where the new thing was happening. A pointed object was hovering over the ground. From one end of it poured a substance resembling fire. It's balancing on the fire, Hum said. That should be apparent even to your old eyes. Cordovere lifted himself higher on his thick tail to get a better look. The object settled to the ground, and the fire stopped. Shall we go down and have a closer look? Hum asked. All right, I think we have time. Wait, what day is this? Hum calculated silently, then said, the 5th day of Lugat. Damn, Cordovere said. I have to go home and kill my wife. It's a few hours before sunset, Hum said. I think you have time to do both. Cordovere wasn't sure. I'd hate to be late. Well then, you know how fast I am, Hum said. If it gets late, I'll hurry back and kill her myself. How about that? That's very decent of you. Cordovere thanked the younger man, and together they slithered down the steep mountainside. In front of the metal object, both men halted and stood up on their tails. Rather bigger than I thought, Cordovere said, measuring the metal object with his eye. He estimated that it was slightly longer than their village, and almost half as wide. They crawled a circle around it, observing that the metal was tooled, presumably by human tentacles. In the distance, the smaller sun had set. I think we had better get back, Cordovere said, noting the cessation of light complacently. I still have plenty of time. Hum flexed his muscles. Yes, but a man likes to kill his own wife. As you wish. They started off to the village at a brisk pace. In his house, Cordovere's wife was finishing supper. She had her back to the door, as etiquette required. Cordovere killed her with a single flying slash of his tail, dragged her body outside, and sat down to eat. After meal and meditation, he went to the gathering. Hum, with the impatience of youth, was already there, telling of the metal object. He probably bolted his supper, Cordovere thought with mild distaste. After the youngster had finished, Cordovere gave his own observations. The only thing he added to Hum's account was an idea that the metal object might contain intelligent beings. "What makes you think so?" Michel, another elder, asked. "The fact that there was fire from the object as it came down," Cordevier said, "joined to the fact that the fire stopped after the object was on the ground. Some being, I contend, was responsible for turning it off." "Not necessarily," Michel said. "The village men talked about it late into the night. Then they broke up the meeting, buried their various murdered wives, and went to their homes." Lying in the darkness, Cordevier discovered that he hadn't made up his mind as yet about the new thing. Presuming it contained intelligent beings, would they be moral? Would they have a sense of right and wrong? Cordevier doubted it, and went to sleep. The next morning, every male in the village went to the metal object. This was proper, since the functions of males were to examine new things and to limit the female population. They formed a circle around it, speculating on what might be inside. "I believe they will be human beings," Hum's elder brother Esquetel said. Cordevier shook his entire body in disagreement. "Monsters, more likely," he said, "if you take into account." "Not necessarily," Esquetel said. "Consider the logic of our physical development, a single focusing eye." "But in the great outside," Cordevier said, "there may be many strange races, most of them non-human. In the infinitude—" "Still," Esquetel put in, "the logic of our—" "As I was saying," Cordevier went on, "the chance is infinitesimal that they would resemble us. Their vehicle, for example, would we build—" "But on strictly logical grounds," Esquetel said. "You can see." That was the third time Cordevier had been interrupted. With a single movement of his tail, he smashed Esquetel against the metal object. Esquetel fell to the ground, dead. "I have often considered my brother a boor," Hum said. "What were you saying?" But Cordevier was interrupted again. A piece of metal set in the greater piece of metal squeaked, turned, and lifted, and a creature came out. Cordevier saw at once that he had been right. The thing that crawled out of the hole was twin-tailed. It was covered to its top with something partially metal and partially hide, and its color, Cordevier shuddered. The thing was the color of wet, flayed flesh. All the villagers had backed away, waiting to see what the thing would do. At first it didn't do anything. It stood on the metal surface, and a bulbous object that topped its body moved from side to side. But there were no accompanying body movements to give the gesture meaning. Finally, the thing raised both tentacles and made noises. "Do you think it's trying to communicate?" Michel asked softly. 3 more creatures appeared in the metal hole, carrying metal sticks in their tentacles. The things made noises at each other. "They are decidedly not human," Cordevier said firmly. "The next question is, are they moral beings?" One of the things crawled down the metal side and stood on the ground. The rest pointed their metal sticks at the ground. It seemed to be some sort of religious ceremony. "Could anything so hideous be moral?" Cordevier asked, his hide twitching with distaste. Upon closer inspection, the creatures were more horrible than could be dreamed. The bulbous object on their bodies just might be a head, Cordevier decided, even though it was unlike any head he had ever seen. But in the middle of that head, instead of a smooth, characterful surface, was a raised ridge. 2 round indentures were on either side of it, and 2 more knobs on either side of that. And in the lower half of the head, if such it was, a pale, reddish slash ran across. Cordevier supposed this might be considered a mouth with some stretching of the imagination. Nor was this all, Cordevier observed. The things were so constructed as to show the presence of bone. When they moved their limbs, it wasn't a smooth, flowing gesture, the fluid motion of human beings. Rather, it was the jerky snap of a tree limb. "God above, Gilrig," an intermediate-age male gasped. "We should kill them and put them out of their misery." Other men seemed to feel the same way, and the villagers flowed forward. "Wait," one of the youngsters shouted. "Let's communicate with them if such is possible. They might still be moral beings. The outside is wide, remember, and anything is possible." Cordevier argued for immediate extermination, but the villagers stopped and discussed it among themselves. Hum, with characteristic bravado, flowed up to the thing on the ground. "Hello," Hum said. The thing said something. "I can't understand it," Hum said, and started to crawl back. The creature waved its jointed tentacles, if they were tentacles, and motioned at one of the suns. He made a sound. "Yes, it is warm, isn't it?" Hum said cheerfully. The creature pointed at the ground and made another sound. "We haven't had especially good crops this year," Hum said conversationally. The creature pointed at itself and made a sound. "I agree," Hum said. "You're as ugly as sin." Presently, the villagers grew hungry and crawled back to the village. Hum stayed and listened to the things making noise at him, and Cordevier waited nervously for Hum. "You know," Hum said, after he rejoined Cordevier, "I think they want to learn our language, or want me to learn theirs." "Don't do it," Cordevier said, glimpsing the misty edge of a great evil. "I believe I will," Hum murmured. Together they climbed the cliffs back to the village. That afternoon, Cordevier went to the surplus female pen and formally asked a young woman if she would reign in his house for 25 days. Naturally, the woman accepted gratefully. On the way home, Cordevier met Hum going to the pen. "Just killed my wife," Hum said, superfluously, since why else would he be going to the surplus female stock? "Are you going back to the creatures tomorrow?" Cordevier asked. "I might," Hum answered, "if nothing new presents itself. The thing to find out is if they are moral beings or monsters." "Right," Hum said, and slithered on. There was a gathering that evening after supper. All the villagers agreed that the things were non-human. Cordevier argued strenuously that their very appearance belied any possibility of humanity. Nothing so hideous could have moral standards, a sense of right and wrong, and above all, a notion of truth. The young men didn't agree, probably because there had been a dearth of new things recently. They pointed out that the metal object was obviously a product of intelligence. Intelligence axiomatically means standards of differentiation. Differentiation implies right and wrong. It was a delicious argument. Olgolel contradicted Arast and was killed by him. Mavert, in an unusual fit of anger for so placid an individual, killed the 3 Holian brothers and was himself killed by Hum, who was feeling pettish. Even the surplus females could be heard arguing about it in their pen in a corner of the village. Weary and happy, the villagers went to sleep. The next few weeks saw no end of the argument. Life went on much as usual, though. The women went out in the morning, gathered food, prepared it, and laid eggs. The eggs were taken to the surplus females to be hatched. As usual, about 8 females were hatched to every male. On the 25th day of each marriage, or a little earlier, each man killed his woman and took another. The males went down to the ship to listen to Hum learning the language. Then, when that grew boring, they returned to their customary wandering through hills and forests, looking for new things. The alien monsters stayed close to their ship, coming out only when Hum was there. 24 days after the arrival of the non-humans, Hum announced that he would communicate with them after a fashion. They say that he could communicate with them. Hum announced that he could communicate with them after a fashion. "They say they come from far away," Hum told the village that evening. "They say that they are bisexual, like us, and that they are humans, like us. They say there are reasons for their different appearance, but I couldn't understand that part of it." "If we accept them as humans," Michel said, "then everything they say is true." The rest of the villagers shook in agreement. "They say that they don't want to disturb our life, but would be very interested in observing it. They want to come to the village and look around." "I see no reason why not," one of the younger men said. "No," Cordevier shouted, "you are letting in evil. These monsters are insidious. I believe that they are capable of telling an untruth." The other elders agreed, but when pressed, Cordevier had no proof to back up this vicious accusation. After all, Syl pointed out, just because they look like monsters, you can't take it for granted that they think like monsters as well. "I can," Cordevier said, but he was outvoted. Hum went on. They have offered me, or us, I'm not sure which, various metal objects which they say will do various things. I ignored this breach of etiquette, since I considered They didn't know any better. Cordevier nodded. The younger was growing up. He was showing at long last. The youngster was growing up. He was showing at long last that he had some manners. They want to come to the village tomorrow. No, Cordevier shouted, but the vote was against him. Oh, by the way, Hum said, as the meeting was breaking up, they have several females among them. The ones with the very red mouths are females. It will be interesting to see how the males kill them. Tomorrow is the 25th day since they came. The next day the things came to the village, crawling slowly and laboriously over the cliffs. The villagers were able to observe the extreme brittleness of their limbs, the terrible awkwardness of their motions. No beauty whatsoever, Cordevier muttered, and they all look alike. In the village, the things acted without any decency. They crawled into huts and out of huts. They jabbered at the surplus female pen. They picked up eggs and examined them. They peered at the villagers through black things and shiny things. In mid-afternoon, Rantan, an elder, decided it was about time he killed his woman. So he pushed the thing who was examining his hut aside and smashed his female to death. Instantly, two of the things started jabbering at each other, hurrying out of the hut. One had the red mouth of a female. He must have remembered it was time to kill his own woman, Hum observed. The villagers waited, but nothing happened. Perhaps, Rantan said, perhaps he would like someone to kill her for him. It might be the custom of their land. Without further ado, Rantan slashed down the female with his tail. The male creature made a terrible noise and pointed a metal stick at Rantan. Rantan collapsed, dead. That's odd, Michel said. I wonder if that denotes disapproval. The things from the metal object, 8 of them, were in a tight little circle. One was holding the dead female, and the rest were pointing the metal sticks on all sides. Hum went up and asked them what was wrong. I don't understand, Hum said, after he spoke with them. They used words I haven't learned, but I gather that their emotion is one of reproach. The monsters were backing away. Another villager, deciding it was about time, killed his wife, who was standing in a doorway. The group of monsters stopped and jabbered at each other. Then they motioned to Hum. Hum's body motion was incredulous after he had talked with them. If I understood right, Hum said, they are ordering us not to kill any more of our women. What? Cordevier and a dozen others shouted. I'll ask them again. Hum went back into conference with the monsters who were waving metal sticks in their tentacles. That's right, Hum said. Without further preamble, he flipped his tail, throwing one of the monsters across the village square. Immediately, the others began to point their sticks while retreating rapidly. After they were gone, the villagers found that 17 males were dead. Hum, for some reason, had been missed. Now will you believe me? Cordevier shouted. These creatures told a deliberate untruth. They said they wouldn't molest us, and then they proceeded to kill 17 of us, not only an amoral act, but a concerted death effort. It was almost past human understanding. A deliberate untruth. Cordevier shouted the blasphemy, sick with loathing. Men rarely discussed the possibility of anyone telling an untruth. The villagers were beside themselves with anger and revulsion once they realized the full concept of an untruthful creature. And added to that was the monster's concerted death effort. It was like the most horrible nightmare come true. Suddenly it became apparent that these creatures didn't kill females. Undoubtedly, they allowed them to spawn unhampered. The thought of that was enough to make a strong man a wretch. The surplus females broke out of their pens and, joined by the wives, demanded to know what was happening. When they were told, they were twice as indignant as the men, such being the nature of women. Kill them, the surplus females roared. Don't let them change our ways. Don't let them introduce immorality. It's true, Hum said sadly. I should have guessed it. They must be killed at once, a female shouted. Being surplus, she had no name at present, but she made up for that in blazing personality. We women desire only to live moral, decent lives, hatching eggs in the pen until our time of marriage comes, and then 25 ecstatic days. How could we desire more? These monsters will destroy our way of life. They will make us as terrible as they. Now do you understand? Cordevier screamed at the men. I warned you. I presented it to you, and you ignored me. Young men must listen to old men in time of crisis. In his rage, he killed 2 youngsters with a blow of his tail. The villagers applauded. Drive them out, Cordevier shouted, before they corrupt us. All the females rushed off to kill the monsters. They have death sticks, Hum observed. Do the females know? I don't believe so, Cordevier said. He was completely calm now. You'd better go and tell them. I'm tired, Hum said sulkily. I've been translating. Why don't you go? Oh, let's both go, Cordevier said, bored with the youngsters' adolescent moodiness. Accompanied by half the villagers, they hurried off after the females. They overtook them on the edge of the cliff that overlooked the object. Hum explained the death sticks, while Cordevier considered the problem. Roll stones on them, he told the females. Perhaps you can break the metal of the object. The females started rolling stones down the cliffs with great energy. Some bounced off the metal of the object. Immediately, lines of fire, of red fire, came from the object, and females were killed. The ground shook. Let's move back, Cordevier said. The females have it well in hand, and this shaky ground makes me giddy. Together with the rest of the males, they moved to a safe distance and watched the action. Women were dying right and left, but they were reinforced by women of other villages who had heard of the menace. They were fighting for their homes now, their rights, and they were fiercer than a man could ever be. The object was throwing fire all over the cliff, but the fire helped dislodge more stones, which rained down on the thing. Finally, big fires came out of one end of the metal object. A landslide started, and the object got into the air just in time. It barely missed a mountain. Then it climbed steadily until it was a little black speck against the larger sun. And then it was gone. That evening, it was discovered that 53 females had been killed. That was fortunate, since it helped keep down the surplus female population. The problem would become even more acute now, since 17 males were gone in a single lump. Cordevier was feeling exceedingly proud of himself. His wife had been gloriously killed in the fighting, but he took another at once. We had better kill our wives sooner than every 25 days for a while, he said at the evening gathering, just until things get back to normal. The surviving females back in the pen heard him and applauded wildly. I wonder where the things have gone, Hum said, offering the question to the gathering. Probably a way to enslave some defenseless race, Cordevier said. Not necessarily, Michel put in, and the evening argument was on. So, that's your little taste of Robert Sheckley, with a few little glitches on my part. Apologies for that, but I guess there's a little bit of character and flavor to having a live reading. Partially, you can see some of what I stumbled over was not just plain speech, but there are little tiny differences. Language is always changing, preposition use, common constructions change over time, but that kind of functional writing, straightforward storytelling, is delightful. It gets its point across quite simply. We are in an era where there's more of an interest sometimes in what sometimes people will say is the kind of workshop prose, something that comes out of a curated space where you're focusing more on the lyricism of the work. There are still spaces where you can have the kind of storytelling that you have here, but they are definitely fewer, in part because the storytelling here is about an idea. It's just about trying out the idea and seeing where it goes. And there's so many wonderful elements to this. Now, I said that the story somewhat escaped the fate of another one. The one I was referring to is The Cold Equations by Tom Godwin, which is a story about essentially the claim of the story, which is the whole point of contention for later debates that come up pretty much every 5 years in genre. The same way that a Jane Austen adaptation comes up every 5 years, every cycle there's a new take on The Cold Equations. And the reason is because it has to do with the morality of choosing your context, choosing your plot, because we authors are gods in some ways. We get to set the entire universe, which means we're responsible for any failings therein. And in that story, you do have this person who is on a mission. He is carrying very vital supplies to a planet, and he has a stowaway. The stowaway happens to be a young girl, and unfortunately, because of the mechanics of the story, the whole point of the story is driven towards the fact that she has to die. And this was more John Campbell, not Godwin tried to come up with solutions in which that's not the case, but Campbell was really enamored with the idea of creating the situation, this no-win situation, where this man would have to kill this young girl. And that is the site of conflict and discussion around the story. along with a kind of pathologizing, it must be, in this age, work like this created license and excuse to talk about murdering women. Violence against women was given tacit exception, and there's definitely a lot of the work in the era. Asimov does not hold up very well in this regard. Arthur C. Clarke has some really ridiculous pieces a little bit later on. Try to read Rendezvous with Rama without being a little bit taken by some of the scenes there. There's definitely sometimes a sense where seeing this or perceiving the genre as a little more of a boys' club meant that stories didn't necessarily consider how they would be read by feminized persons. We do, however, live in a much more rich, complex age, and we do have stories like Kij Johnson has a story, Mantis Wives, that involves the idea of a species reflecting. It's a very lyrical piece reflecting on the different ways that these mantis wives kill their husbands, which is both unfair to the husbands and also to the praying mantis that is being used as a framework. And I love Kij Johnson, so I'm not criticizing her at all. But it's just about calling attention to this detail. One of the most commonly known colloquial concepts about this species is the idea that they killed their mates. The females kill their mates during coitus. And that's a little unfair because it does happen sometimes, but it's usually high-stress situations. It's usually in enclosures, a little bit like the whole alpha male phenomenon came from studying pack behavior in extremely stressed environments. So the alpha mentality comes out when under pressure. It's not intrinsically and universally true. Mantises do need a little bit of nutrition. It's tough business, coitus, but not always killing the male. Long way of saying that we have complicated discussions around these stories. The reason that the other story became the center of this is in part because it was elevated in a reprint, but best of some of the golden era in the 1970s, and so it became elevated again and became the site of conversation again. That didn't necessarily happen with the monsters. And so it gets to live in this sort of blissful moment where it just has some really interesting concepts, but without all of that extra broader cultural baggage. You can see that there are some really interesting choices that are being made here. It does, absolutely, use the specter of domestic assault to an extreme, violence against women to an extreme, to make its point. But immediately, the entire point is that the humans don't. So the presumption is this magical future where humans actually don't kill their wives. So that's a little bit progressive, right? The most important component early in the story comes from the way that the main characters identify themselves. They are human. And those are the key things. Are you human or monster? And obviously, any species that perceives itself, that has a sense of self-awareness and sentience in that particular mode, is going to see itself as the standard. It's the baseline, and everything against it is going to seem monstrous. And that's such a wonderful science fictional concept. It comes up in other work as well. James Tiptree Jr. has a very famous story looking at morality through what we realize as a spider-esque creature and their way of seeing life and seeing the cycle of love and death. Beautiful. Wonderful piece. And there are others as well. This estrangement, the idea of actually being able to remember that what we take for granted as our baseline is something that we feel intuitively more than fully understand. In this species, Sheckley has created logical reasons for it to be very different. It still sees itself as human, and it sees its approach as moral. If someone interrupts 3 times, kill them. If they're annoying, kill them, because it's rude. It's rude to exist in that way, and rude things shouldn't exist. And if you have a surplus population of 8 females to every 1 male in a culture where there isn't necessarily, or in a species design that doesn't necessarily seem to have much use for them, it must be that maybe some other time in the evolutionary path there was less likelihood of survival overall, who knows, but now they've gotten to this point where to stabilize the population, to make sure there's enough for everyone and that there's not any kind of lack or scarcity, this is necessary. And one of the wonderful things about the story is it talks, the female characters as well are also, in fact, they're even more extreme and strident about it, which it's easy, it's very dangerous, but it's easy to make some connections there to feminized people in our world who sometimes vote against their own interests and are self-policing in some really vicious ways. But it would be, I think, really a huge misstep to read this as a direct corollary in any way. Some of the characteristics of the women in this culture, the females being the ones who are married, and then the females in the pen, you can make those uncanny connections if you want to, but I think it misses the larger point, which is that you are supposed to be sitting with the idea that what we presume as humans is based on a body of assumptions that come from our biology, from our culture, our aesthetics. That's another thing that comes up in this work, is that Cordevier has an immediate revulsion that never goes away because he truly cannot understand how something that looks the way that these creatures look could ever possibly be moral, because there is an aesthetic component to morality. And so that guides his understanding, and it works for them. There's also a lovely sense of play. I don't know if you folks noticed it. I hope it wasn't one of the parts I fully stumbled over. But there's this wonderful part where Hum goes up, and the spacemen, one of them is pointing at the sun, pointing at the ground, and pointing at himself. And we as readers, we know what he's doing. Oh, he's trying to get the other person to say the word so that they can start to develop language. Point at sun, hear what they say. That'll be the word for sun. But that's also making an assumption. Hum thinks that, maybe he's trying to start a conversation. And what we get from the story is that one thing that these men love to do is have a conversation or a debate. So he's like, okay, they're trying to, converse. But he immediately goes into a different kind of conversation. Ursula K. Le Guin has a few stories like this too. She, based on her own experiences, exposure to anthropology, knows full well that there are a lot of presumptions made by people who are trying to understand another culture. But they're present in other work as well, but very playfully and very subtly. There's no follow-up. There's no explanation. There's a trust in the reader, and it comes in part from the efficiency of these stories. Punch it out and get it published. But this wonderful tension, this idea of just sit with the concept, just allow it to exist without... Well, you can worry it with all kinds of debates, any debates that you want, but without needing deeper subtext, you can just enjoy the surface of the story as well. Like, it's just a pleasing read. And you can definitely go further into what we might do if the story had gotten the same treatment as some of the others. There would be a lot of worrying over what's meant by the other here, who are this other species of quote-unquote humans. What are they supposed to represent in terms of an analog to real-world cultures? But I really think that would be straining. It's certainly possible. You can use the story, you can adapt it that way, but I think it'd be straining the main premise, which is just to imagine that we as a species, wherever we are, whatever community we have a sense of intrinsic morality, a claim that we know what moral virtue is, and it is almost invariably shaped by our own conditions. And the other wonderful point that's made here, quite critically, is that maybe there is something a little tiny bit monstrous about the humans, because they do break a promise. They get upset. They're here to learn about this other species, but the moment they see this other species slaughtering its women, they start to tell them what to do. So that unfortunately rings very true to humanity. So there is this question built into the story that maybe the creatures that we might consider monstrous for how quickly they discard life have a little bit of a point, that we are untrue creatures. We say untruths. We are capable of saying it, and we will. It's awful. We're just terrible. And that's something to sit with. So a delight. And I definitely have a little bit of faux-nostalgia about what would have been like to be in an era where those were the kinds of stories that you saw everywhere. You open the pages and you're going to be given a new idea to sit with. And it's going to be written by someone who's just churning out a million things in his crumbling brownstone, trying to make a living, trying to get by. But the efficiency of just focusing on those what if, It's an entirely different era of mind-opening fiction. The one benefit, I don't really have to be faux-nostalgic about it, is that I get to read them today. And so there's this wealth of wonderful work. I don't think it's good to think about it with too rosy glasses, rose-tinted glasses. It's just another era. It's just another time that had its own pressure points, its own issues, but it is and can be an absolute delight. So I hope that gives you some food for thought. For those of you who've read Sheckley before, I hope this was a nice trip down memory lane. And thank you, as always, for following along. We're going to get back to more contemporary work. I think we'll be doing an Asimov's review next, and then we'll move into some indie pieces. Then we also have a Clarkesworld to do. And then we will also, in some point in the next 2 months, do a work from 2024, a book. So hopefully there'll be a lovely range, and if one week you're just not interested, hopefully the next week we'll have some content for you. Thank you for following along. Liking and subscribing, again, is not something generic. It actually does something with the algorithms behind. So YouTube is always checking to see if you're worth investing in. So when a person reaches enough followers on this blasted social media hellscape that we all occupy, then you get access to more options as a creator. So it is what it is. But otherwise, whatever you're reading, whatever you're enjoying, just take a moment to really reflect on the material context that allowed it to come into being. Hopefully that deepens your enjoyment of the work. Until next time.